Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to those of you with us in the room and to those of you joining us online from around the world. My name's Heaven Crawley, and I lead research on equitable development and migration at the UN University Centre for Policy Research here in New York. This event, co-convened by UNU-CPR and the Office for the High Commission for Human Rights, focuses on what we know about the relationships between migration and inequality, with the aim of ensuring that issues of equality are front and centre in the implementation of the Global Compact on migration. So why do we think it's important to focus on issues of equality? Well, we know that there are huge inequalities in the world. The world is becoming increasingly unequal, wealth is increasingly concentrated, and income inequalities are rising almost everywhere. We also know that there are structural inequalities in relation to race and gender, sexuality and age, religion, language, and culture. But the relationship between migration and inequality are not straightforward. We know that inequalities can drive migration, inequalities in access to resources, in opportunities for decent work or to study, in access to social protection, or indeed the right to be safe. But there are also huge inequalities in the right to move. Much depends on the passport you hold, assuming you hold a passport at all, of course. So those, for example, holding a German passport can travel to 176 countries visa-free, compared to just 36 countries for those holding a Nepali passport. These inequalities have a huge impact on the experiences of migrants. They're associated with a lack of rights for migrants and their families, difficult, expensive, and often dangerous journeys, and precarious working and living conditions in the countries to which migrants travel. And we've heard a lot about these inequalities over the last few days, including how they've been deepened by the COVID-19 pandemic. As I said, though, the relationships between migration and inequality are not straightforward, and they are not inevitable. Migration also has the potential to reduce inequalities for the individual and his or her family, and indeed more generally, for example, through the redistribution of resources, by opening up educational opportunities, by enabling women to enter the labour market or escape gendered violence. So migration can play a key role in the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. Whether or not this potential is able to be realised depends in large part on the policies that are put in place, not just in relation to migration, but across a whole range of other policy areas, some of which are clearly related to migration and others seemingly not. So the aim of this event, then, is to better understand the relationships between migration and inequality, both generally and in specific geographical contexts, and to consider the implications of these inequalities for the implementation of the Global Compact on migration. And we have three very eminent speakers with us to help us do that. Before I hand over to them, I just want to say a little more about what we know about the relationships between migration and inequality, based in large part on the findings of work currently being undertaken by the MIDEC Hub. The MIDEC Hub is an international collaboration of nearly 100 scholars across 5 continents that aims to build an evidence-based understanding of the relationships between migration, development, and inequality. It's led by researchers living and working in 12 countries in the Global South, and it's gathered a vast body of data and research evidence on these relationships. And I'd just like to highlight 3 emerging findings from the data, which I think are very important to our discussion here. Firstly, it's clear that inequalities associated with migration are often intersectional. So whilst the Global Compact on Migration highlights the need to reduce gender inequalities, for example, other inequalities or the intersections between them are largely ignored. Racial and ethnic inequalities are equally, sometimes more important in the context where MIDEC's researchers are working. So in Brazil and South Africa, for example, racism and xenophobia, rooted in the histories of slavery and apartheid, respectively, shape the experience of migrants living there today, and these processes are often deeply gendered. Secondly, inequalities associated with migration are often structural. They reflect a long history of unequal political and economic relationships between and within the countries of the Global South and the Global North. These inequalities are deeply woven into the fabric of societies. In Haiti, for example, the focus has often been on the problems associated with corrupt political leadership within the country, ignoring the structural inequalities and associated interventions that have undermined the country's governance capabilities. These issues cannot be addressed through improved migration management alone. What is needed is a wholesale reconsideration of the broader socioeconomic and political conditions that drive migration and undermine its development potential. Thirdly, MIDEC's research has highlighted the impacts of migration-related inequalities for those that do not move, as well as those that do. So research in the Nepal-Malaysia corridor, for example, draws attention to the experiences of those left behind, especially the wives of migrants who have to manage households in their absence and in the context of gender and other inequalities. Again, many of these inequalities have been deepened by COVID-19, and we don't hear very much about the families of migrants in migration policy debates. So having set the scene then, I'd like to hand over to our speakers to tell us more about their understanding of the relationships between migration and inequality in the context within which they're working, and the ways in which different inequalities intersect to shape migration opportunities and outcomes. I'll introduce each of the speakers in turn, and they will speak for around 7 or 8 minutes to ensure that we have time for your comments and reflections. And before we finish, I'll return to our speakers and ask them in just a few minutes to give us 1 or 2 very concrete examples and recommendations that we could undertake to ensure that issues of inequality and equality are front and central in the implementation process. So first, I would like to introduce Professor Louis Hearns-Marcelin. Hearns is Associate Dean of the Program Development and Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Miami. He's also Chancellor of the Inter-University Institute for Research and Development, INURED, in Haiti, and he's co-director of the MIDEC Hub. Thank you, Hearns. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Collet. And I just have slight corrections. I'm now the director of the Global Health at the University of Miami, so which is wonderful. So, and as you mentioned so clearly, this roundtable of the International Migration Review Forum offers research organizations such as the MIDEC Hub the space for discussion of progress made in the implementation of some of the objectives of the GCM, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migrations, including as they are related to the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Here, drawing from our fieldworks conducted in MIDEC's migration corridors in many countries in the Global South, particularly the Americas, I focus on 3 key issues we think should attract our attention. Of course, Professor Collet mentioned the intersectionality of migrations and inequalities. I will start with that. As we know, global inequalities are reflected through regional and local systems of inequalities and inequities to profoundly shape migration processes and outcomes. And yes, we know that under the right circumstances, the potential for migration to contribute to human development, as codified in many ways in the Sustainable Development Goal, is tremendous. However, in large part, due to the entrenched complex vulnerabilities resulted from social exclusion, ever-expanding marginalization, climate-related disasters, wars, human rights abuses, and violence, most populations in the Global South are stuck in communities depleted of any basic conditions for a human life. And yet, these circumstances are the ones that determine who is and is not able to migrate, who enters inexpensive migration trails at unaffordable costs to their families left behind, who engages in the treacherous migration trails that make up the corridors we have been studying. We rightfully pay a lot of attention to the perils and tragedies faced by migrants in these trails of abuses, tears, and injustices throughout the Global South. Results from our study suggest that we should also put an equal attention to the path dependency created by the societies and communities of origins where these migrants come from at the first place. Those communities, in many cases, entire societies, are the generators of vulnerable migrations, exposed to systematic abuse and exploitation. In the case of the Americas, Haiti epitomizes such complex process of continuum of intersectionality between inequalities, inequities, and migration. And these have been observed through the treacherous migration trails from Haiti to South and Central America to US-Mexico border and back to Haiti. We use the concept of circulation to frame these fluid patterns of circulatory migration. In these constantly changing trails, Haitian migrants who were already unprotected and deprived of basic rights at home carry their path dependency to systemic vulnerability compounded by unequal access to rights and social protections, and the unwillingness of many state and institutional actors across the Americas to adopt steps that could address them. Here I need to insist on the irony of member states of the United Nations bringing to bear the mantra of safe, orderly, and regular migration, while the very global institutions and states that promote this noble aspiration have engaged in direct institution building in Haiti for almost 3 decades, and yet fail to show why they were there at the first place. To advocate for safe, orderly, and regular migration, civil society organizations and state actors must reconcile the idea that levels and magnitudes of vulnerabilities of migrants in foreign nation-state borders, while in their perilous journeys, are profoundly linked with the ones that shape their very conditions in their community and societies of origin. In the case of Haitian migrants, one can legitimately ask, what have the international community done during the last 3 decades of active engagement with Haiti to help rebuild the very institutions that have left this population to be exposed to multi-layered vulnerabilities of predatory migration? Over the last 3 decades, the United States, the UN, and the United States in particular, who is the major player in Haiti politics, Canada and France, have witnessed the accelerated disappearance of Haiti's security and rule of law institutions. These institutions have been actively destroyed by the very politicians and dominant rulers and the international community has been supporting. Today, Haiti is unlivable for young Haitians due to gangs wars sponsored by the very politicians and businessmen we are supporting. And the educated youth, the talents of Haiti, that Haiti could count on to rebuild its institutions and create space for hope for the new generation growing up, are caught up in different migrant trails in communities in Colombia, Panama, Mexico, Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, etc., in search of a place to live because Haiti's rulers, backed by powerful countries, have taken away their right to live. While the tragedy of Haiti, with its systematic institutional collapse, human insecurity, and its population in search of the right to live, facing gang violence, rapes, kidnapping, generalized fears with no institutional accountability, rule of law, and hope, the country and its population still face the cold indifference of the very global actors who profess safe, orderly, and regular migration. I think that this paradox needs to be thought about. The second point I want to speak to rapidly, briefly, is the importance of placing the migrants' multidimensional experiences, their voices and concerns, to our understanding of data. Objective number 1 of the GCM rightfully asks to collect and utilize accurate and disaggregated data as a basic for evidence-based policies. Accuracy and disaggregation, however, must go beyond mathematical standards. Migrants' experiences are more than statistics, trends, and modeling. These efforts in data collections, analysis, and incorporation within policies must extend to capturing migrant histories, contextual analysis of the structural forces that shape their experiences, responses to challenge, and migrant initiative in context of transit migrations. Our studies throughout the global South have shown that the increasing marginalization in many societies, accelerated crisis in communities and countries such as Haiti, set the stage for emerging migration trails, one more dangerous than others. At the same time, we shall not ignore that the circulatory movements of migrants have also given rise to unique interactions with local communities along the migration trails. It is therefore important to understand the impact of transit migration, to communities through which migrants transit. The documentation of community-based solidarities, local institutional supports will help us identify locally driven ways to foster conditions that help people to create new forms of communal solidarities. Such data will help us understand what forms of community-based migration protections can be scaled up. And the last point I want to rapidly address, and since I have only 1 minute, and then after that I may come to a certain point, is that in the context we have been describing, the protection of migrants starts with the rebuilding of institutions at their home countries. In the case of Haiti, it starts with member states' support for the development of a democratic space conducive to citizens' effort to transform depleting state institutions into right-based instruments capable of protecting the Haitians in their own countries. This agenda can help member states, particularly the United States, Canada, and France, as well as the United Nations and other stakeholders, to create support for reforming Haitian foundational government functions across all sectors, particularly security, justice, and rule of law. This engagement would then extend to other countries where the trails are crossing to address and reduce situations of vulnerabilities for migrants. And with that, I go back to you, Professor Heaven, and for further discussion. And I will come back again on certain points later.
Thank you, Professor Marcellin. I think you've raised a number of really important points about the particularities of context that we'll, I hope, come back to in the discussion. So thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Pia Oberoi, a Senior Advisor on Migration and Human Rights for the Asia-Pacific region, based in the Bangkok office of UN Human Rights. Pia is responsible for developing and implementing research and policy on migration and human rights in the region. I'm grateful for your support for this event, Pia, and would like to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heaven, and thank you again for convening this meeting. OHCHR is very pleased to co-sponsor it, and I'm really glad to be here to have this conversation. Very quickly, because I know we'd like to get into a discussion, I just wanted to kind of bring the human rights perspective, I think, into this discussion, and thank you to Professor Hans as well for raising a lot of the issues that I wanted to discuss. Because human rights, of course, is at the heart of equality, and the lack of human rights brings us to situations in which we experience inequalities very deeply. The principle of non-discrimination, which is fundamental to the human rights framework, of course, calls us to address the kinds of structural dynamics that you've both identified already in the discussion. And of course, addressing these imbalances is also part of the SDG agenda through, more specifically, Goal 10, and the links between the SDG agenda and the international human rights framework is really important and well understood. I would like to highlight, from a non-discrimination perspective, the importance of looking at migration status as well as a ground of non-discrimination. And the fact that it's included in the SDG agenda, I think, is a really important point, as well as looking, as you've said, about inequalities between countries as well. Heaven, you've already pointed out that not everybody experiences movement or indeed immobility in the same way. Looking at immobility, if we look at the kinds of dominant paradigms of migration, for instance, in the Asia-Pacific region, through these temporary labor migration corridors, we can see how immobility actually intersects with lack of access to rights. But you've also mentioned race, class, how you travel, if you can travel, where you leave from, where you arrive. I'd also like to look at the legal categories, and I will later in my presentation kind of look at some of the ways in which these categories of people on the move intersect with their experiences of rights fulfillment. The legal and indeed the discursive categories of refugee or asylum seeker, migrant worker, undocumented migrant also determine the ability to access rights in the categories in the context of mobility, even when these categories may be imperfect. And I think that is something that we see, particularly in the region that I am working in now, but more generally. And it speaks to what I feel has been a bit of a silence in the discussions that we've heard over the course of the last few days at the IMRF, at that space between the GCM and the Global Compact for Refugees, where there is space for building up an idea of complementarity, or whether this is seen as a conflictual space where these categories kind of rub up against each other. So I just wanted to very quickly talk about some research that we've been doing from the office's side in the Asia Pacific, which is focused on pathways and on vulnerability. And as you might know, in the GCM, within certain of its objectives and actions, the concept of migrants in situations of vulnerability has been now embedded within this framework, which speaks to where people left from, how they transit, and I think that point was really well made by Hans, and also their personal characteristics. So it's not a legal definition, but it is a contextual understanding of how people are on the move today. And similarly, pathways, there is a commitment among states in the GCM to expand administrative, legal, or policy mechanisms for entry and stay. Now, these can be before or after people arrive on the territory. They can be temporary or permanent. And the point I want to make before introducing a bit the research is that we shouldn't see these pathways as a zero-sum game between labor pathways or asylum pathways or humanitarian pathways. Expanding pathways for the situation of migrants in vulnerable situation will not impede the creation, should not impede the creation of adequate pathways for asylum, or should not complicate labor migration pathways. But this is a conversation I think that should be had in the context of the GCM. The other point that I'd like to make more contextually is that we should interrogate while still calling for pathways, we should interrogate this idea that it may not necessarily follow that more pathways will solve the kinds of governance issues that the GCM sets out to solve. Not all migrants will be able, but not all migrants will be willing to enter regular pathways, because irregularity can be a choice depending on what the alternatives are, and also more protective of rights in certain circumstances. And I'd really like to pick up that critique of orderliness in migration that you started, Hans, because I think it is important to ask for whom this orderliness is important, to what end, and why indeed disorderliness is a problem. Who is it a problem for, and how do we solve that? So very quickly, we have this publication which is mapping the situation in the Asia Pacific. As you know, 1 in 3 in 2020, roughly 1 in 3 of the 282 million international migrants came from the region. 1 in 7 are living in the region. The bulk of this migration is intra-regional. It is also the most populous region in the world, and the most rapidly developing, with some of the highest levels of wealth and income inequality. With aging populations, sizable youth populations, very vulnerable to climate change and natural disasters. And all of these factors are implicated in the drivers of mobility within and from the region. So what we set out to do was really to look at 17 countries in the region and analyze entry and stay mechanisms, focusing on countries that host significant migration flows or are GCM champion countries. What we've learned is that in the Asia-Pacific region, regional discussions of mobility have quite infrequently considered the need for migration pathways beyond labor migration pathways. And there's a very active and important discussion happening about how to improve those pathways. But this study contends that the region needs, in addition, to devise and implement pathways that respond to other imperatives. So, for instance, our study found that of these 17 states, 11 actually provide pathways that are explicitly based on human rights or humanitarian grounds. 16 have a form of family unification in their legislations. 10 have comprehensive anti-human trafficking laws. 17 offer visas in some way for education purposes. And 13 provided visa amnesties to foreign nationals due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So some sorts of the common forms of protective pathways that are available include discretionary humanitarian entry based on conditions either in the country of origin or the specific circumstances of the individual, and I'll come back to discretion in a minute. They provide temporary residence permits on medical grounds or for study, often including visas for accompanying parents or guardians. And I think, just as a side note, it's important to understand that the pathways for medical treatment or for study may indeed permit migrants to realize their human rights, particularly where the treatment or study is unavailable in the country of origin, or where removal from this might cause a breach of rights. We've talked about family union mechanisms and trafficking, but also special permits for migrants who have been victims of domestic violence, regularization mechanisms, and residence permits based on the idea of integration of evidence of enduring local social ties, and of course, COVID-19 pathways. In terms of best practice, and I think that that is an important part of understanding not just that there are pathways, but how we can improve them to ensure that they protect rights. We've come up with 7 recommendations. The first, that they should be based on human rights, so that they should be underpinned by human rights obligations in law, and that they should set out to improve the enjoyment of those rights. They should also provide alternatives to return for people that are in undocumented and irregular situations. So, for instance, implementing the fundamental principle of non-refoulement, and looking at the various ways in which forced returns might not be the only option available to migrants and governments. They should be responsive to the reasons why people are on the move. And in our region, we've talked about climate and the environment as an important driver of movement, exploitations, violence, how gender intersects with drivers of movement, but also age. These pathways should be accessible. In terms of the information that people can receive about them, the cost of the pathways, the fact that we need them to be timely and available, but also that they're firewalls so that undocumented migrants don't fear penalties in approaching them. They should be predictable and rules-based. All of the countries studied had a discretionary pathway available, which does open up a space for people. But this discretion needs to be rules-based. And finally, they need to be both secure, providing a status and access to rights, as well as inclusive. And I'll stop on that point because I think that we've been talking a lot about the whole of society principle of the GCM. And very infrequently do we find migrants and their communities part of these kinds of policy discussions about the implementation of pathways. So it's important that we include them. Thanks.
Thank you, Pia. I think, I think that intersection, as you say, between inequality and rights is absolutely critical, and very grateful for that overview and that introduction to the research, which I shall be reading on my plane home. I think also that point about ordinance and regularity, in whose interests, and the relationship between the Global Compact on Migration and Refugee Convention, this issue of categories, and the way in which ultimately policies determine who's regular and irregular, and therefore, if that's the case, they can arguably change to incorporate more within some of those access points. So thank you for raising those points. Our final speaker today is Dr. Jason Gagnon. Jason is a development economist with the OECD Development Center and leads its work on migration and development, producing, again, more empirical policy-based reports and coordinating the policy dialogue on migration and development. So thank you, Jason. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to frame my inputs here through 3 different ways that we've been working and that we view the intersections between inequality and different migration contexts. And as you know, the Development Center is primarily focused on the links between migration and development through a policy lens, so I will have that sort of overarching umbrella on my inputs. The 3 ways that I wanted to discuss inequality were first, inequality and integration or inclusion into host societies, which is probably the most direct way that most people think of inequality and migration. But I also want to speak about inequality in the access to migration, and Heaven alluded to that earlier. And then something which is increasingly becoming a matter of concern, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, is the inequality and access to remittances and the whole agenda around remittances. And I'd like to finish on a couple of policy responses that we've been working on the global, regional, and local levels. So on the inequality and integration issue, one of the areas that we find is particularly important is the area of social protection and health and access to these. And we've been running a number of projects, one of which looked at whether forcibly displaced persons in a number of low and middle income countries had access to social protection both de jure, so in a legal or theoretical perspective, but also following that up to see if there was actual access. And we've done this, as I said, in 12 different countries, and we found a couple of interesting things. The first was that the legislative or the de jure side of access to social protection was actually rather good. There is quite a bit of legislation that doesn't necessarily give access to all types of migrants, but is at least clear on who should get access and whether they should get access, especially under situations of forced displacement. But when you look at whether that actually turns out to be the case, it's actually rarely the case. There are lots of different situations where the de facto access is primarily low, especially when it's compared to access to local citizens. And there are a number of reasons for that. It's not only that there's discrimination or that there's difficulties in the field, but there are also a number of technicalities that need to be addressed, such as the way that we collect data on forced displaced persons. And that surprisingly includes IDPs. We found that IDPs themselves didn't have access to social protection even within their own country. So that was one way that we saw the interactions there. The second is we feel there's a strong need to focus on how youth interact with the services in their host countries, and we're running a project now through Nomad, where we're looking at in 8 different countries what the process of integration and inclusion within those countries looks like at the intersection between being young and being migrant. And so we're doing focus groups across a number of youth, the youth population, and comparing that with a number of focus groups that we're doing with young people that are not migrants, and trying to understand whether the challenges and difficulties they find in accessing jobs, accessing services, accessing finding themselves in society. It's obviously a very challenging time of life. How much that matters for how much migration or being a migrant matters in that realm. And then the last place that we think is important to focus on here is on migration within Africa and the inequality that we found, that we continue to find across that. And we're just at the cusp of a rather large project on that, looking at the mobility of skills, given that there's going to be a large demographic shift in Africa over the next few years, and there are lots of global agendas or regional agendas in Africa that will need to tap into those skills, such as the AC Free Trade Agreement. And we feel that the breaking or challenging or addressing the inequalities across migration within the continent is going to be a key fundamental part of moving that agenda forward. So the second point on inequality was in access to migration. And here I just wanted to make a couple of larger points. One was that we're seeing this shift of migration, the source of migration change across the globe. There's a lot of attention in Africa, and I find that the rise in migration in Africa are quite natural, given that the emigration rates are rather low. And so this is really just a shift towards the demographic changes in the country, but also the fact that, as I mentioned, the general youth movement in Africa is more educated, they're more mobile, their aspirations are different from previous generations. And we're seeing that come out as an important manifestation of migration. But there is inequality in the access to who accesses that. So there's inequality between countries. So we're seeing Africa kind of catch up, if you will, in terms of emigration rates. But we're also seeing inequality within who has access to migration within those countries. And one area that we've been particularly emphasizing at the Development Center for quite a few years now is that it's not just about who has access to policies. You might be regular or irregular. You might you might have access to migration because you have access to certain types of visas, but it's also the general policy environment that people find themselves in. And one way that we're looking at this actually through MIDEC is through access to social protection policies and initiatives within the country. We're doing this with the Overseas Development Institute, and looking at whether accessing or having access to such programs is actually lifting certain financial constraints that may have inhibited people to migrate. And so far, the findings show that it's really not clear. There's a lot of different. I think it's very, very contextually focused. But we're going to move now. We've done a literature review. We're going to move now to looking at the data that Heaven spoke about, that we collected, and look at whether that plays a role in who has access to migration. The third point was on the access to remittances, and here I'll be brief because I know I'm probably getting very close to time. And the concern here is really on the shift towards online or digital platforms to remittances and the access to those. It's a great thing to have a shift into the digital world in terms of remittances. It's lowered costs significantly. It's increased the safety of remittances. It's increased the speed of remittances, and those are all things, as you all know, are very much entrenched into the SDGs. But it's also concerning that many people simply don't have access to those. And so as we shift towards a new way of remitting and traditional money transfer operators become less competitive, we strongly feel that we need to focus a little bit more about first of all, providing the tools and providing the assets that people need to access those, but also supporting physical money transfer operators. And this was particularly striking during the pandemic when we actually had a lockout and people could not physically access money transfer operators. And so the only ones that could access any types of transfers during a time where their families most needed it were those that had online access and computers. And then finally, on the policy response, I already alluded to that quite a little bit by saying that we think that the policy response is much broader than just looking at the narrow migration-related policies. But taking another step from that, if you move up to the highest levels of government and look at the way that countries have drafted their development planning or development strategies, even their sectoral strategies, we don't see that inclusion or all of these issues, remittances, access to migration alone are not anywhere or not very often in those strategies, but they're also not even thought about in the ways of inequality, and that's an issue for reasons of mobilizing funds and resources, because that's exactly what these plans are meant to do. They're meant to give either the Prime Minister's office or the highest executive offices of the government to channel down through these strategies funding and resources and capacity. But it's also concerning about where the agenda is heading, because if this is simply not there yet, and it really remains within the Global Compact on Migration, within the IMRF, well, then we stay in our own world and we don't actually connect with all of the other important agendas that are probably at minimum just as important, if not more important, in connecting to get to these objectives. And with that, I'd like to thank the chair.
Thank you, Jason. That's really appreciated, and particularly I think that point that you made at the end about the policies that we need to sort of look at, and not just in relation to migration. And when you come to the IMRF, the focus is very much on migration policies, with very little discussion about those broader contexts, which of course shape the kind of structural inequalities that you were talking about, Hearns, in terms of what the drivers of migration are, and the kind of interrelationships with the communities and with different sectors of society. So thank you. I think you'll agree all of our speakers have given quite different examples and insights into the relationships between migration and inequalities, structural, access to rights, what happens on arrival, and I think, I think really, really helpful overview. We have a little bit of time for some comments or reflections or even questions from those in the room. Those of you who are not sitting at a table and don't have a mic, you're very welcome to come and ask a question or make a point if you wish to do so. don't know if we do have access to, so if anybody online would like to either make a point, make a reflection, you can do so in the chat, I believe, and we'll pick those up as well. So we have, as I say, 10 or 15 minutes. You're very welcome to make your points. Would you like to, please? The mic is yours.
Thank you so much for illuminating a lot of issues, not just practical but also structural, really specific to groups, contexts, and jurisdictions. And I think particularly around colonialism, slavery, and anti-poor, queer, gender framing of labor. I think also more importantly highlighting the levers of identity and upholding human rights law. And youth more importantly. So my name is Dimiso Gacha. I am from a queer youth-led, managed and serving NGO, grassroots NGO based in Botswana called Success Capital Organization. And I am reminded of the burden of proof, not just in the context of injustice and inequality, but also now having to educate and then seek redress, which can be really quite exhausting and tasking. And I think my question is really around the fact that many activists are co-opted, if not weaponized, even within the context of safe spaces and advocacy. And I think the panel has shown that these conversations cannot occur in isolation of human rights and sustainable development. Are there avenues for restorative justice and development for the most marginalized of migrants, particularly diverse adolescents and youth? I think that's the first one. And then just the last one is really around how can we sustain dialogue in environments where migration policy frameworks and knowledge production, particularly those that erase intersectional vulnerabilities, where they're already narrow and they're already denying diverse migrant groups of dignity and recognition. And I think this is particularly from an intersectional, not ableist, gendered perspective to address the multifaceted challenges that they face the world over.
Thank you. I'll hand over to you, Hans, on the structural inequalities in spaces.
Yeah, I wanted to.
Press again.
Okay, sorry about that. I wanted to, to stress there is a point that's important that you mentioned here is the whole challenges that we face in policymakers face in capturing specificities, contexts, situations. In fact, the whole discourses around migration has always been, evolving in the global, kind of taking into consideration global processes, but without understanding how these global processes intersect with realities of people in everyday life, national context, regional context, a youth, age, gender, sexuality. We are not too good at that. And I think that to maintain a conversation, we have to create space in order for this kind of dialogue in research and in policy making to happen from the bottom up and not only from the top down. Because we are very good in defining, objectives, specific objectives, developmental objectives, sustainable goals and whatnot. But we are not good at executing them. Why? Because first of all, the way that we understand the processes is a kind of bird's eye view of things, but we don't have the details of context and the understanding the partners at play, who are the partners who are supposed to execute those objective policy goals and so on and so on. So there is a kind of need from not just research perspective, participatory perspective, but also from policy making and policy executions to open the gate to communications with different situations and contexts in which people live their lives.
Thank you, Hans. Here.
Just one, I agree completely with what was just being said. I think one of the issues that we hear is also around public narratives and how when people enter into countries, the public narrative tends to pit vulnerable groups against each other, if you will. I mean, you have people that are coming in that are residing in communities of color and residing in communities facing discrimination and poverty. And what tends to happen in terms and coming from the policy-making environment, I would say in a lot of cases, is a way to kind of divide and conquer almost and place one group really against each other. And I think that speaks again to this whole of society approach about building bigger, larger communities of us rather than trying to whittle down the people that are arriving against those that are coming from as marginalized situations as they left.
Thank you, Pia. And just in that context, of course, the UN Human Rights own campaign, #Stand Up for Migrants. I think it's really a very useful toolkit to help people to think about the kinds of narratives and different ways of positioning things in terms of really issues of identity and access to social justice more generally, which of course connect communities rather than dividing them. So I don't know if you wanted to come back on that, Jason?
Yeah, I can. Thank you. Those were excellent comments, and I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things you said. One was on the avenues for development for youth, and I think two of the major issues that we're facing in the work we're conducting across Africa on youth and migration development is one is defining skills. And defining the right skills that youth have. There's a lot of focus historically and traditionally on hard diplomas and things like that, but those are not necessarily the ones that get you jobs, or they get you jobs, but they're not necessarily the ones you use in your job. And so we're trying to shift towards a softer skill definition that might be more useful to the local labor markets. And the second thing is. So the work, I just wanted to give it a bit of an insight in the work we're doing on the focus groups on youth in a variety of countries. And we just finished a pilot study in Nairobi, where we started the discussion by asking what people, or what the youth's favorite dish was to eat. And it was an excellent starting point, because they started alluding about they started alluding about the food, and they started alluding about their home country. But then the narrative really turned about how they may not like other dishes, and then it really became, I think, exactly what Pia said, that they tended to feel that they were being pitted against other vulnerable groups in the country. And just a very quick point on the point you said on leveraging productive reports and things like that. I think the one tangible result that I've seen over the last 20 years on this issue, on migration and development, is that we've broadened the group significantly. And I can't stress enough the fact that the only way we can do this work and make it happen is by connecting with CSOs, with activist groups, with local governments, and now the hot topic, if you will, is connecting with the private sector. But those are discussions we weren't necessarily having 20 years ago. So I think there's definitely a move towards in the right direction.
For the question, which has obviously triggered a lot of responses. I don't know if anybody else in the room has any comments or questions. If not, I'm going to do Chair's prerogative and come back on also answer or respond to some of the points you were making. I think in this discussion, and Hans, you raised it as well, around Objective 1 and around data, first of all, what I've really noticed in the discussions over the last few days has been the focus on statistics, and really government statistics, no other kind of statistics, and the absence of these kinds of other types of information that you're talking about, Jason, in terms of the things that really give us an insight or an entry point into understanding what migration means and what the intersections are with different kinds of inequalities. And I think we also need to sort of be very explicit about the fact that most research on migration historically has been undertaken by the Global North, with funding from the Global North and by researchers who are based in the Global North. And I think that gives you, and increasingly funded by Global North governments as well, often for policy reasons. So I think we have to be clear, and I think this is something that MIDEC really engages with, that we need to shift the production of knowledge, not just away from the Global North, but away from those kind of top-down, bird's-eye view, as you described it, ways of thinking about and understanding migration, because the contextual specificities are so particular that there simply isn't a way to capture those through these kinds of statistical approaches, I think.
Yeah, and I think that
you were good.
Okay, you good.
Back on.
Okay.
Okay. Yep.
That's me. Yes, I think that you are totally correct. And one of the big experiences we have been doing in MIDEC, has been to realize that there are a lot of shifts in paradigms that we need to do. The issue is not that we are against quantitative data, quantitative measures. Things have to be measured. We have to know how many people flows from one place to another, the rate and all those things. Those are important. We need to model things. Those are fundamental. However, modeling alone doesn't tell us anything about the lives experiences that people are experiencing, how people interact with communities, how they are receiving. In fact, you have progressively, with the bird's eye view approach and the quantitative approach, we ignored sovereignly, all those other realities, of initiatives in which that you see an agency at play between migrants and communities. It's not just about, people, exploiting people in the migration trail, but it's also people, communities that receive people. We don't create spaces for that. We don't know how to identify them so that we can scale them up. Yes, I think that the experience of MIDEC has allowed us to understand the continuum, of these configurations of, of processes. Yeah.
Thank you, Hans. I think we have a question or a comment online. Christina, do you want to?
Yes, happy to read it out. So this is from Pablo Cernades in Argentina. So hello, Pablo. He references Pia's points on migrants in vulnerable situations and the need for regular pathways. And he notices a worrying increasing trend of policies or practices from several countries which lead to an inversely proportional relationship. He mentions the more vulnerable the situation of people is, the fewer opportunities they have for access to regular pathways, for both leaving their country, entering another one, and also for getting a residence permit. So we would be interested in hearing from any or all of the panelists on that. And we have a second question as well, if I might put that in. So this is from Henrietta, and she mentions witnessing national policies' impacts on migration privilege, certain forms of migration and people, while criminalising others, and intensify inequalities in migration. She mentions a country that is revising their migration laws. The current laws are currently steeped within apartheid laws, so I think you can guess what country that is. And how can migrant organisations address these systemic inequalities?
Thank you. Maybe go to you first, Pia, because of the question from Pablo, and then open up to anybody else who'd like to make a comment.
Sure. And thank you, Pablo. Nice to virtually hear from you. I think it's a really important point in terms of how vulnerability is kind of addressed through the migration journey. And I think it's important that we kind of bring voice in. I mean, I think it is really about working with affected communities to understand what the vulnerabilities are in terms of how the remedies then can be accessed. Because the bird's eye view that you talked about, Hans, I think is absolutely right, is that the policy is made on the basis of certain data that is available to us that are about statistical, even census data, but we're not actually getting into the communities to understand where the vulnerabilities lie and hearing from them their experience. I just wanted to make one point about the bigger picture of this. One of the principles of the GCM is a whole-of-government approach as well. And I think one of the problems that we're seeing, and it speaks also to the issue that was being raised in the second question, is that much of migration policy is not made with an eye to addressing the issues at hand, addressing the kinds of either vulnerabilities or lack of access, etc. It's made with an eye to a domestic political audience, about signaling and kind of putting in context an idea that the government would like to put out. It's not policy that is being made in good faith, and that is one of the problems, I think, with kind of having a discussion without having the whole-of-government approach, where you have your technical line ministries, making good policy, but actually that's not really the point. And I think we need to address that through the GCM principle.
Specifically to the point from Henrietta, I think in interest of time, we completely acknowledge that the situation in South Africa, indeed, and not just in South Africa, I think it's really important when we talk about narratives, we don't just think that these negative, hostile narratives are happening in the global north. They're also increasingly a feature of many of the contexts within which MIDEC is working, and is really critical to try and stretch out the discussion away from migration towards these broader issues of structural inequalities and how they're linked to migration and the responses to it. We are going to have to finish soon. I wonder if I might just turn to each of our speakers in turn and just briefly ask you to give us one or two very concrete recommendations in relation to the objectives of the GCM as to how we might actually centre equality in the implementation of the compact.
Yes, and briefly I would say that what I have been saying for a long time now, the whole idea of bringing communities' voices, bringing migrant voices into the debate, into the discussion. Again, it is very wonderful for us to design beautiful policies, but if we cannot connect with those who are going to implement them, if we don't, survey those who are finding ways, local ways, to respond to these challenges, we won't know what to scale up and how to scale things up. So fundamentally, it is a very important point. The second point I would put here, I think that there is the elephant of the room. I'm not talking about Haiti just because of the fact that I am from Haiti. The point is, if we have, the GCM has a whole government approach, Haiti has no government for many years, and everybody is saying that everybody says nothing. The United States, the European Union, France, all the countries, they have, I see all this week, people talking about migrations and drivers of migration, inequality and so forth and so on. And then the elephant is in the room here. You destroy governments, you let them, the destruction fester, and then after that you say, what am I going to do with the migrants? So we, in the civil society, we have to have the courage to take things a little further, to challenge the dominant discourses that comes, through generalization, globalization, big data, big models, and bring precisely communities, nations, and people in the context of things. And finally, racism is at the core of a lot of things that are happening in migration. I mean, Haiti is so exemplar to see how black bodies are undesirables in all countries in Americas. And to see many countries are targeting Haitians by having specific laws for Haitians. And at the same time, those same countries come, in UN arena to posture, and champion the orderly, regulated migration. We have to work, we have a lot to do.
Absolutely. Thank you, agreed completely. Pia, if I may.
I just wanted to say that, what I'm trying to, in this, we were looking at Objective 5 on pathways and Objective 7 on addressing and reducing vulnerabilities. And I think that what we've seen is that the governments have these in their toolbox. They have, alternatives to the kind of forced irregularity that we've seen, the forced deportations, the kinds of situations that place people in unequal and disempowered situations. So that the toolbox is there. The pathways may not be ideal, they may not fully protect rights, but at least the starting point is there. And I think that the question is a broader contextual one about the conviction that there is also a political benefit to making these pathways available, for instance. There's a political benefit to addressing vulnerability, and that change can only come through the narratives of society and addressing not just the migration discussion, but the racial discrimination discussion, the racial justice discussion, how women can be empowered to be agents and not just seen as victims of violence. So I think that it's that the conversation is good about the GCM. It's given us a lot of important technical tools to carry on to. But the broader context, we can't forget about the struggle and the importance of involving communities in struggle.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pia. Jason.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Pia. And like Pia, I'd like to draw on a couple of the compact objectives. The first is, generally the point is, and that's, I think, the entire point of this panel is to recenter inequality in the GCM. And I think there are a couple of objectives where that speak to the points that I said earlier, where inequality should probably be more discussed. The first is on Objective 16, which is empowering migrants and societies to realize full inclusion. Not only more focused on inequality, but lots of the discussions we not only hear, but we generally hear are on high-income countries, and I think we need to refocus that on the whole continuum of migration. You have immigration countries or hosting countries all over the world that simply don't get the same attention on these issues. And as just to cheat, I'm going to add another point in there, which is I think the objective on investing in skills development is very much important. I've rarely heard it over the last few days, and it strongly connects, I think, to this empowering migrants. And I'm a big fan of providing or addressing inequality through education. And the second objective is on remittances. We focus a lot, and it's normal because it's connected to the SDGs. We focus a lot on promoting remittances and promoting cheaper remittances, but I think we also need to think about the access to remittances and the inequality therein.
I would perhaps, again, take a bit of prerogative and just highlight Objective 1. We've talked about it a few times during this panel, and indeed you've, Pia, presented some new research evidence. I know, Jason, you're doing work as well at OECD. And another plug for MIDEC, I guess. We are very much at a stage where we have a huge amount of data, very rich data, very contextual data in our countries of research. You can find out more about MIDEC on the website, which is www.mideq.org. MIDEC stands for Migration for Development and Equality. We really believe that migration has the potential. I know we talk a lot about the inequalities, but we really believe that migration has the potential to contribute to the SDGs and indeed to contribute to equality, but only if it's able to be undertaken under the right circumstances, and this is where potentially the GCM has a role to play. So I'd really like to thank all of our panelists for a really excellent discussion, really excellent points. Thanks to those who asked the questions or made the comments online or in the room, and we hope to follow up with you in due course. Thank you.
Thank you.